The Pakistan-Afghanistan border crisis is best understood as a repeating chain reaction in which history, security, and economics collide at the same choke points, especially crossings like Torkham in the northwest and Chaman in the southwest, so that whenever violence spikes or trust collapses, the first visible consequence is usually a border shutdown, and the deeper consequence is a widening political quarrel that becomes harder to reverse with each cycle. The historical backdrop is the Durand Line, drawn in 1893 to mark the frontier between British India and the Emirate of Afghanistan, later inherited by Pakistan after 1947, and long disputed in Afghan political memory, a dispute that never fully disappears and helps explain why issues like fencing, border posts, and who controls what can become flashpoints even when both sides say they want stability. In modern times, however, the most immediate fuel is security, because Pakistan argues that armed militants, prominently Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, TTP, use Afghan territory as a base to plan or stage attacks inside Pakistan, while Afghanistan's Taliban government denies allowing Afghan soil to be used for cross-border assaults and rejects being held responsible for violence in Pakistan, and that fundamental disagreement has sharpened since the Taliban returned to power in Kabul in 2021. According to reporting that outlines the arc of relations, Pakistan initially welcomed the Taliban takeover but soon concluded the new rulers were not delivering the kind of cooperation Islamabad expected on curbing cross-border militancy, and as militant violence rose in Pakistan in subsequent years, particularly in the northwest, the border increasingly became both the symbol and the instrument of pressure, with closures and skirmishes disrupting daily life even during nominal ceasefires. The border is also an economic artery, and that is why closures are never just administrative. When crossings close, trucks carrying cement, food, medicine, and transit cargo can sit for weeks. Traders lose money as goods expire or spoil, and a corridor that normally moves large volumes of bilateral and transit trade becomes a parking lot of stranded drivers and stalled supply chains, pushing businesses to look for uncertain alternatives through Iran or China, and forcing ordinary people to absorb the costs of politics they did not create. This economic pain is not theoretical. Reporting from the prolonged closure period describes how the shutdown dragged on far beyond the short disruptions that border communities were used to, halting trade, stranding cargo, and worsening losses on both sides, while also creating knock-on effects for Afghan imports and for Pakistani exporters who depend on Afghan routes to reach Central Asia. Alongside this, the humanitarian layer has grown heavier as large-scale Afghan return movements, driven by tightening documentation regimes and repatriation policies, have increased pressure on border management and deepened fear and insecurity among displaced or undocumented populations, with humanitarian analysis of 2025 returns describing millions of Afghan returns overall and emphasizing that policy shifts in neighboring countries, especially Pakistan and Iran, contributed to abrupt departures, loss of assets, and heightened protection risks, meaning that at the same time the border is being treated as a security frontier, it is also functioning as a mass transit route for people whose legal status and safety are precarious. The recent crisis timeline that shapes the latest situation update begins with the most serious fighting between the two neighbors since the Taliban took Kabul, when clashes in October 2025 escalated into deadly exchanges and pushed both governments towards ceasefire talk efforts that did not produce a durable settlement, leaving the underlying dispute unresolved and the crossings vulnerable to being closed again whenever the next major incident occurred. By early 2026, that next trigger arrived in the form of major militant violence inside Pakistan, and Pakistan's renewed insistence that the threat is being enabled from across the border. And in this atmosphere, Pakistan carried out strikes inside Afghanistan that it framed as selective targeting of militant camps or hideouts linked to attacks on Pakistani soil, while the Taliban authorities contested Pakistan's claims, described civilian harm, and condemned the strikes as violations of Afghan sovereignty, and crucially, independent reporting highlighted the sharp divergence in narratives. Pakistani security sources asserted large militant casualties, while the UN mission in Afghanistan reported civilian deaths, creating a dispute not only about what happened, but about what counts as legitimate self-defense versus unlawful cross-border force. Once that line is crossed, strikes inside the other country, the border itself, tends to heat up quickly, and that is what was reported in late February 2026. Afghan and Pakistani forces clashed again along the frontier, and both sides offered competing who fired first versions, with Afghan officials describing Pakistani fire near the border, and Pakistani officials characterizing Afghan fire as unprovoked near the Torkham area, and claiming Pakistan responded, a pattern that is typical of the crisis because neither side wants to concede initiating violence, and both want the diplomatic and domestic advantage of being seen as reacting rather than escalating. At this stage, the crisis becomes less about a single incident and more about deterrence messaging, Pakistan signaling that it will strike across the border if it believes militants are operating from Afghan soil, the Taliban signaling that it will respond at a suitable time to protect sovereignty and credibility, and that is why the risk of escalation remains high, even though the two sides are not matched in conventional capabilities. The stronger side can still find itself pulled into repeated cross-border actions, while the weaker side can still retaliate through border raids, pressure at crossings, or indirect actions, and in every iteration, the people most immediately affected are those whose lives depend on a functioning border: truckers sleeping in their cabs, traders watching inventory rot, patients trying to access medicine, and families seeking safe passage, while the broader region feels the aftershocks through disrupted transit routes and rising uncertainty about whether commerce can continue without being hostage to the next security incident. The latest situation, therefore, is not a single headline but a condition, an unsettled frontier where the Durand Line dispute supplies long-term mistrust, where militancy accusations and denials supply immediate triggers, where airstrikes and retaliatory threats harden positions, where border closures translate policy conflict into daily hardship, and where humanitarian pressures from large-scale returns and tougher documentation enforcement add another layer of volatility, making the Pakistan-Afghanistan border crisis best described as an ongoing contest over sovereignty and security, fought in the language of border posts and crossings, but paid for in the currency of disrupted lives and frozen trade, with de-escalation dependent on restoring some minimum trust or mechanism for addressing militant threats, without crossing into cycles of strike and response that repeatedly turn the border from a gateway into a front line.